And now we're about to turn to Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis, although we have to read two words on Ayin Vav, Aleph and bottom Omar Ra. We have to be Omer Dover B'Shem Omer. So now we start on Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis. And Rav says the following. Basar, you have the meat of an animal, shchuta, and the meat is kosher. It's been slaughtered properly, and it's shamen. Shamen means it's very fatty meat. Now, in the case of something that's shamen, we have a very strong odor, which is called in the Gemara's language recha, reach. And sla'o im basar nevela kachush. In the same oven, he roasted the animal of nevela, meaning something that's osur. Kachush, kachush means lean, it's not fatty. Osur. Even though there was no negia, there was no contact between the basa shchuta and the basa nevela, nevertheless the basa shchuta is osur, and Rav is saying that the reach is called the tam. The tam, it's not the tam of the goof of the actual physical basa nevela, but rather it's the smell, the flavor of the basa nevela that is transmitted and is absorbed by the basa shchuta, by the kosher meat. My timer, what's the underlying logic of Rav's chumrah? Gemara says, "Mefatmi mehadadi." Mefatmi, like Peter Makatoris, means misbasmin. There's a smell, and they share the smell back and forth. So the smell of the basar nevela k'chusha is now transmitted over to the basar shchuta, and therefore it's us. Levi Omar afilu basar shchuta kachush. I'm going to go even further, lakula. I'm going to tell you that even if the kosher meat was kachuch, was lean meat, and shetzla'o and basar nevela shamen, even if the treifa meat, the nevela, is very, very fatty, and they were both roasted in the oven simultaneously, mutter, my timer, what's the underlying logic of Levi? Recha bi'almahu v'recha lav miltzer. If there's no actual contact between the Isser and the Heter, then the Heter is not boleh the Isser. You'll tell me the Heter was boleh the flavor, or the what we call Recha, the fragrance, the smell of the Isser. No, the Torah doesn't consider that as Tam. Reach is not considered Tam. Lav miltzer. And this machlokas here, by the way, is very relevant today in contemporary life with regard to ovens. You know, I used an oven for fleishiks, and now there's a reach of fleishiks. Now, can I use the same oven for milchiks? Levi would say it's no problem because recha lav milsa, but Rav Paskins recha milsa. Ovid Levi uvda bereish galusa. There was a case in the Reish Galusa's house where they actually had a reach of isur that was transmitted to something of heter, and bigdi v'davar ach. Gdi is kosher meat, and it was roasted in the same oven simultaneously with a davar ach. The Gemara doesn't even want to use the word chazir, a pig, pig's meat, but I have to use it only to explain what a davar ach is. And Levi was materid. He said, go ahead and eat the meat of the gdi. It's kosher meat, and all it has was reach, and reach is lav mils. Meisvei, we're going to ask a kash on Levi from a brisa. Ein solin shnei psachim ki echad. At the same time, in the same oven, you're not allowed to roast simultaneously two pesachs that belong to two different chaburos. Mipnei ataroves, because there's going to be a mixture of the two Karbonei Pesach, or Karbonos Pesachim, we'll call it. And now each one is eating something that's Shalol Limnuyav, that comes from a different Karban Pesach. And a Pesach Shalol Limnuyav is awesome. My lav tarovis ta'amim. Shouldn't we assume that like Rav would interpret this brisa, there are two psachim being roasted simultaneously, say oven, but there's no negia, there's no touching between them. So the only thing that's being transmitted is the tam, the flavor of the odor of the reach. Is kasha levi. We see that you're not allowed to eat this carbon pesach because it was roasted simultaneously with another pesach, and you're eating shalol ibnuyov. And what makes it shalol ibnuyov, even though there was no contact between this and that, but because of the reach, sisi recha milsa, lo. That's not how you interpret the brisa. When the brisa says mipnei taroves, it's mipnei taroves gufin. It means that we're afraid that at some point during the roasting process, there will be a contact between the two lambs. We're going to support this reinterpretation of the brisa based on the seif of the brisa. The brisa says, "Afilu gidi utle." If one korban pesach was a kid, a young goat, and the other was a lamb, nevertheless, it's going to be asur. Why? If we're talking about a fear of contact one with the other, Hainu diktani. Now I understand the brisa. We need the brisa to be machadish in the sefer that afilu gdi utle. That even though they're very different, we still might not pay attention, walk away from the oven, and somehow in the interim there was contact between the karbanos pesach. You would have said in the Havamina, if not for the sefer of the brisa, that it's clear that this is fleh and this is gedi, and never the twain shall meet. There was no contact between them. No, from Ashmalon, the Mishnah is saying we're not putting up a shomer there that he's watching, surveilling constantly, that there was no contact. Ella, but if you could interpret the way Rav would have interpreted this brisa, tamim is referring to the reach, is maligdi utle maligdi gdi. What difference make what kind of an animal he's roasting in the oven? It's totally irrelevant. All we want to know is whether the reach went from one to the other, and it makes no difference whether it's a lamb, a goat. The whole thing doesn't make any sense. Ella, now the Gemara raises the following objection. You're telling me that from the seif of the brisa of basu gedi and basu tle, that you're not allowed to roast them together. Al karch, you must interpret the brisa mipnei taroves as gufen udi asur. That the reason why it's asur is because we're afraid that there would be contact. That's how Levi would interpret it between the two karbanos pesachim. Aval taroves tamim shari. And now we're interpreting in the way Levi wants us to interpret, that if there would have been a definite conclusion, we were absolutely certain that there was no negia between the two, then it would be mutter. What about Rav? Rav holds that Recha Milsa, Lemet Hevi Tuvta, the Rav. How can we defend Rav and interpret the Sefer, which was approved to Levi? Rav Yirmi Achamay Askina, and this way Rav would interpret the Brisa. It's a case of Kigon Shetzlao B'Shtei Kderos, that they were roasted in two different utensils, so there was definitely no reach. Reach only applies when you put two things in the same utensil or in the same oven. But here they were placed into two different pots, and therefore there's no reach. So we would see us there's no reach. Had there been a reach that would be transferred from one to the other, it would have been awesome. Wait, the Gemara says, what do you mean? You mean kederos? You can't mean kederos. Kedera, the word kedera is a pot in which you cook. There's no way that you can cook a korban pesach. That's a lavdo rice. Ella ema, we have to little change the brisa. Ke'en shtei kederos. He's using a phrase in the brisa of shtei kederos, but it means ke'en shtei kederos, meaning there were two ovens, they were separate, or perhaps there was a spit on one side of the oven, a spit on the other. It's ke'en shtei kederos. And it could be that what they did was to make a separation between the two karbanos pesach of Chabura A and Chabura B. They piled up afar, or perhaps gicholim, they piled up coals. Anyway, it was clear that there was a blockage, there was a mechitza between the two. It's like shtei kederos. And this is what the Bryce is saying. Ein sol and shnei pesachim kechem nei taroves. And what does it mean, taroves? Why are we worried about taroves when you simultaneously roast two different pesach in the same oven? Is taroves tamim? Because we're afraid that the tam from one pesach will enter into and penetrate the other pesach. Afilu kain shtei kederos. Even though you'll convince yourself that there was a mechitza between the two korbanos pesachim, it's like two kederos. The leket taroves tamim. Nevertheless, it's also why? Because mishum taroves gufin vafilu bigdi vitle. In other words, Rav doesn't deny that even if we can neutralize the element of reach, because we have this mechitza between the two, but nevertheless we still have to worry about negia, because the mechitza is not hermetically sealed, and there's a possibility that he didn't realize it, and there was an actual contact between the two pesachim, which is called in the Lashon HaShas taroves gufin. Amar Rav Mari. This reminds me of my first cousin, Mari Burzon. Anyway, all of a sudden. Kitanoi is a machlokus here, not only between Rav and Levi, but we could trace it down back to the Tanoim. And now we're going to learn a Mishnah in the 10th paragraph of Trumos. Harode paschamo. He removes a fresh, hot, baked challah from the oven. Unisanon, what did he do with it? Al pi chavis yain shel truma. He had a barrel of truma, wine of truma, and he covered the barrel of the wine with this very hot loaf of bread that just came out of the oven, fresh kebab. And the question is, if I'm not a Kohen, am I allowed to eat this loaf of bread? Rabbi Meir Oser. Rabbi Meir says that you're not allowed to eat it because it has the status of truma, because the reach, the shmek of the yayin was nodef, it penetrated into the loaf of bread. Rabbi Yehuda Mati. Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't care about reach. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to be the shoulders on which Levi is going to stand, because Levi says reich alav mils. Rabbi Yossi comes up with a compromise sheet. And what does he say? Matir b'pashal chita v'yosef b'pashal siorim. He says there's a different propensity between barley bread and wheat bread. In the case of barley bread, he says mitnesha saorim shavos. The barley bread actually absorbs the reach that's coming up from the chavish al yain, which is truma. Whereas chitim, if you made a bread out of wheat, that's a tougher kind of bread, and eno shavos, it is not absorbed. It doesn't absorb the reach of the truma. Is my lav tanoi? The simplest way of understanding and explaining this debate recorded in the Mishnah Trumos is based on Rav and Levi. The Maharsov Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can eat the pots even though you're Israel and not a Kohen. Like Levi, who says that reach is not considered halachically a tam of basar or a tam of truma in this case. Umar Sava, but Rabbi Meir holds recha milsahi. Now, I said that Rabbi Meir holds recha milsahi. That's according to the Rif. Rashi learns that it's both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. Just that Rabbi Yossi holds that in the case of a paschitim, because it's a tough loaf of bread, don't start off with a loaf of wheat bread, it won't actually absorb the reach. But fundamentally, reach milsa, which means that in the case of a pashal siorin, we have to prohibit the pas to Yisrael because it actually absorbs the reach of the ayin shel truma in the chavis. The Rif has a different shot, and according to him, Rabbi Yossi fundamentally agrees that reichel lav milsi. But the reason why Rabbi Yossi is machmir in the case of a pashal siorin is for a different reason, says the Rif. He holds that there's going to be some absorbing of the lachluchas, of the actual wet molecules of yain shel truma. So the Gemara answers, Levi vadai tanoihi. Levi would certainly agree that Rabbi Meir, and maybe even the way Rashi interprets Rabbi Yossi, are against this sheet. They hold reicha milsa. Therefore, the Israel cannot eat this bread because it has absorbed the reach of truma from the yain shel yain. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda was matir the loaf for a non-Kohen, and Levi will stand on the shoulders of Rabbi Yehuda. But Lerav, according to Rav, maybe he could square with all the shittas, even with Rabbi Yehuda. Nema Tanoi, should we say it's Machlokas Tanoi? Amalcha Rav Kuli Alma, everybody agrees Recha Milsa. And the Torah recognizes Reach as if it was the actual time of the Gufa Basar, or in this case, the Gufa Yayin of Truma. Rabbi Yehuda holds that you're allowed to eat the loaf. That's because Rabbi Yehuda holds that a hot loaf of bread is not going, even though you put it on top of a barrel of wine, it's not going to absorb the reach of the yayin. Go smell the bread, do a test, and you'll see you don't have, there's no shmek of yayin in the pot. So the Gemara says that I'm going to prove to you that there's no need to assume that that Mishnah in Trumos is really a machlokas in which one shita, meaning Rabbi Yehuda, is against Rav, because Lav Hitmar Allah Dahi, with regard to the interpretation of that Mishnah, we have a comment of Rabbah, Amar Rabba Barachana, Amar Reish Lakish, Bepaschama v'chavis psucha, if the bread is right out of the oven, it's still burning hot, and the chavis, we didn't ask this question before, is it open, the barrel, or is it closed? And here we're talking about a case where it's open. Is divrei hakol aser? Everybody agrees that in this case, the reach coming up from the yayin in an open barrel is going to penetrate into the very hot loaf of bread on top of it. Furthermore, on the other extreme, pas sonens v'chavis megufa, if the loaf of bread is already cooled off, and this barrel of wine is completely sealed, is everybody difficult to mutter, because there is no reach of yayin that's going to be penetrating into the cold loaf of bread. Lo nechleku, where's the machlok between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi? Ela bepas chama v'chavis chasuma, pas sones v'chavis psucha. What if we have one negative? Either the bread is hot, even if the barrel of wine is closed, or the bread is cold, but the barrel of wine is open. Rabbi Meir holds that in this case there's going to be reach and a bli of reach, either because of the hot pas or because of the open chavis. And Rabbi Yehuda says no. There would only be an issue of reach if you had both negatives, meaning if the pas was hot out of the oven and the chavis was psucha, which we said at the beginning of this presentation, Reish Lakish, everybody agrees that it's also Kisreicha Milsa. The Hanami, and now let's take the case that Rav addressed initially. We had Basa Shkuta that was being roasted simultaneously in the same oven with Basa Nevela, and we're going to assume that that's also according to Rav because it's like Paschama v'chavis psucha damya, and in fact everyone would agree, even Rabbi Yehuda in this Mitzius would agree that it's Aser and Reicha Milsa. Everybody accepts the principle of Reicha Milsa. And Rabbi Yehuda would say if you have both Pas Chama and Chavis Psucha, then the non-Kohen is not allowed to eat the Pas. And in the parallel case, if you have two pieces of meat that are being roasted simultaneously in the same oven, everything's hot, everything's open, it's like the Chavis Psucha with the Pas Chama, and therefore everyone would agree it's also because the reach from the non-kosher meat is going to penetrate into the very fibers of the kosher meat. Tani Rav Kahana Breder Rav Chinina Saba Pas Shafa'a im Tzli Bitanur also li ochla bekuscha. If you heat up in the same oven a loaf of bread, take dough and you bake it in an oven. At the same time that you're baking in the oven, you're also roasting a piece of meat. There was no contact between the two. Also, li ochla bekuscha. This is a reflection of Shitas Rav. Rav Kahan accepted Rav's principle of Reicha Milsa, and you cannot eat this pas with milchitz, with kuta. And the reason for that is because the pas absorbed the reach of the meat that was being roasted simultaneously in the oven. Ahi binta de itfa bahadi bisra. There was a story of an oven in which they baked both fish and meat at the same time. There was no contact between the fish and the meat. Asur Rava Parzika. Rava mi Parzika said it's awesome. The Michli Bekuscha. You want to take the fish and eat it with milchiks. Again, you see from the Gemara that fish can be eaten with milk. That's not a problem. But here you can't eat it with milchiks because it was bolea, the reach of the fleishiks. So you have now, in effect, fleishik adat, fish that's fleishik, because it was roasted in the oven simultaneously with meat. And now you want to eat with this fleishik fish, you want to eat milchiks, that you can't do. Mabrav Ashi Omar, afilu b'milcha, nami asur. Let's say you want to take the fish and dip it into salt. You can't eat the fish. Why? Mishum didad kashya l'recha u'ledavar. Fish that has an absorption of the time of basar in it, of meat, is going to cause not good things. Reach hapeh is going to be bad. Davar acher means tzaras. So we don't eat fish and meat together. Again, we took this Gemara way, way beyond the Gemara. The Gemara was talking about a case where you actually roasted fish and meat simultaneously in the oven. And that's one thing. That's Reicha Milsa. We go even further. And for some people, I remember my shver, the reason why we don't eat fish with meat is it's an excuse to have a shnach between the fish and the meat. Don't all laugh at once. Okay. Now we start the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Ayin Vav Hamid Beis. And now we're talking about a Tameh at the time of Yudalad ben Nisan. He cannot bring the Pesach, and the Torah in Parshas Baloscha commands him to wait a month and bring it on the 14th of Iyar, the Pesach Sheni. However, there are cases in which we will be makriv a korban, even though this tumah, and we will not push it off and delay until Pesach Sheni. And the Mishnah now lists 5 such korbanos, which can be brought b'tumah. And of course, on that list is going to be the korban Pesach, and that's the most important one for us on the list. Hamisha Dvarim, there are 5 cases of what we call a korban tzibur, boy b'tumah. We can be makriv them tumah, which means that rov hakahal, most of the community of Israel are tmeim, or alternatively the kohanim are tmeim, or alternatively the klei shares are tmeim. In all the cases, we will bring the korban tzibur b'tumah. Number one, but ein echal b'tumah. If we are tamei, we're not allowed to eat from the meat of kodshim, and the isur of a tamei eating meat of kodshim is a very severe isur. And what are these 5? Number one, Omer. And as you know, on the 16th of Nisan, from the new tefua, they brought the korban Omer from barley, and henceforth all the tefua was considered yoshan, and you could eat it, the new crop. Shtei lechem, which was brought on Chag HaShavuos, and that was matir chodesh in Migdash for menachos. Lechem apodim are the 12 challahs that are organized, 6 on one side, 6 on the other, on the shulchan in the heichal. Zivchei shalmei tzibur, which means that on Shavuos, together with the Shtei Lechem, they brought kivsei atzeres, which are called shalmei tzibur. It's the only case, as far as I know, of shlomim that are brought by the tzibur. Shlomim is classic korban yachid, but here we're talking about kivsei atzeres. Useirei Roshei Chodashim. These are the sirei izim that are brought on every Rosh Chodesh. All the above are brought b'tumah because they all are korbanos tzibur. Now, we add another case where we can go even further. Not only can we bring the korban b'tumah, we can even eat the korban b'tumah, and that's Pesach haba b'tumah nechal b'tumah. Why is it that Pesach, as opposed to all the other korbanos tzibur, override tumah, not only in terms of the akrava, but even in terms of the achila, and we can eat the basar Pesach b'tumah? And the Mishnah answers because shaloba mitchilas el achila. If the Torah allows you to bring the Korban Pesach, even B'tumah, it must be that the Torah is allowing you to eat B'tumah, because the whole purpose of a Korban Pesach and its very essence is Achila. And it says, Ish lefi achlo tachotzu al haseh. The seh of the Korban Pesach is for the purpose of lefi achlo, for eating it. If the Torah was matir the Korban Pesach b'tzibur b'tumah, then the Torah was certainly matir eating the Korban Pesach, because the whole purpose, the whole agenda of a Korban Pesach is for Achila. The Gemara asks, Chamishal amute mai. We always ask this question in Shas. Whatever the Mishnah gives you a number, why mention the number? It must be excluding another thing. Because otherwise I can count to 5. I can't count to 10, but I can count to 5. Gentlemen, you have to laugh at my jokes. I can't even. All right. Anyway, limute chagigas chamishasa. On every regel, a chagiga is brought on the regel. This has nothing to do with the chagiga of Yudalit on Erev Pesach. There's another chagiga. We're talking about the chagiga of a regel, 3 regalim, on the first day of Yom Tov. And if the carbon contracted tumah, or the people are tummy, or the kohanim are tummy, etc., we will not bring the carbon chagiga. Chagiga of Tesvav, or the 15th, does not override tumah. Salkid, I would have thought, you know what? Chagiga is a carbon tzibur, and we have a rule that a carbon tzibur overrides tumah, and it should apply to chagiga as well. Kevon the carbon tzibur. Now, the Gemara is assuming that chagiga is a carbon tzibur. I mean, that's a mouthful, because in truth, the tzibur does not bring a carbon chagiga. Carbon chagiga is brought by the yachid. Every individual is chayv, but since they all brought the chagiga together as one, it gets upgraded to the status of a carbon tzibur and kviyale moed. And there's a definite time, urgency of a moed, and we're going to see that the whole halacha that for a carbon we override tumah, that's only because of the word moed. And therefore, based on these two principles, we should come to the conclusion that the karma chagiga, like any other carbon tzibur that has a kviyus man, overrides tumah. Kamashmalan, the Mishnah wants to teach us, the islay tachlum and kol shiva. In truth, by the way, we should know that the fact that chagiga doesn't override tumah is actually derived from drashos in the Gemara Chagiga. But the Gemara here, the Mishnah here, is giving us a reasoning. Why is it that Karban Chagiga, as a Karban Tzibur, falls short of any other Karban that's brought by the Tzibur that overrides Tumah? And the answer is the Itzlei Tashlum and Kol Shiva. Although we bring the Karban Chagiga Lechatchila on the first day of Yom Tov, if we haven't done so, we have the entire balance till the end of the 7 days to bring the Karban Chagiga. And therefore, it's not actually time bound. It's not really moed. Although it starts, it gets kicked off on the moed, but it can continue for the entire Shivas Yimei HaTashlumin. It's therefore lo dachya Shabbos, and midi Shabbos lo dachya Tumah. There is an absolute connection, almost inseparable, between Tumah and Shabbos. Anything that's Docha Shabbos is Docha Tumah. It's not Docha Shabbos, it's not Docha Tumah. And we're not going to be Docha Shabbos with the Shechita of a Chagiga, since we have Tashlumin. We'll tell you, wait until after Shabbos. The Gemara asks, V'nisni nami se'ire regolim. Every yontif, the Torah commands us on all 3 regolim to bring se'irim. They are called se'ire chatos. These are also karbanos tzibur. And it's bad b'tumah, necham b'tumah. It should have been listed here as number 6. So the Gemara answers, it is listed here. Hatanile, it's included under the phrase Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur. We thought that Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur was referring exclusively to the Kivsei Atzeres that are brought on Chag HaShavuos. No, it's referring to any carbon that's brought at a specific time by the Tzibur, and that includes the Irim of the Regalim. I don't understand. If you're telling me that this phrase in the Mishnah, Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, is all inclusive, and therefore there was no need for the Mishnah to mention Se'ire Regalim, is the Hachi Se'ire Rosh Chodesh Nami Lo Nisti. Why do you have to mention Se'irim that are brought on Rosh Chodesh? They should have no different status than the Se'irim of Regalim, which are included and swallowed up into Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur. The ton is Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur. Amri, so they gave the following answer, and here we're taking a look at A's. A's means Azus the Kedusha, Ayin Zayin, Se'ire Rosh Chodesh Mitzvah. the Mishnah felt compelled to write out explicitly Seirei Roshei Chodashim. There was a Havamina that Seirei Roshei Chodashim are not considered Kavul Lem Zman, and therefore they would not override Shabbos and not override Tumah. Salkid, that Kabina would have thought. Holok Sivuhu Moed. And in fact, if you go through the Parsha of the Moedim, which is in Pinchas at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, you will find that the Torah says Elu Tasel Hashem b'moadechem, and that pasuk is not referring to Rosh Chodesh, and therefore Loksiv Moed is Kamashmal, and no, it does say Moed. Well, I looked at Parshas Pinchas, I didn't see Moed with regard to Rosh Chodesh. So what does Gemara mean that there is Moed on Rosh Chodesh? Kamashmal Rosh Chodesh Shikrei Moed. Why? Not because of Parshas Pinchas, but because of Parshas Emor in Vayikra Chav Gimel, Rosh Chodesh is mentioned in the context of Moed. Kid Abaye, and Abaye also derived from a pasuk in Tanakh that Rosh Chodesh is called Moed. The Omer Abaye says Tammuz the High Shata, Tammuz of that year, the year of the Meraglim. You remember the Meraglim came back, and the night after the Meraglim gave their terrible report, the people were crying. And Chazal say that Bachisa Bechia Shel Chinam Ani Tikva Bechia Shel Doris, that's Tisha B'Av at night, is Miluye Malye. The Bezdin was Ma'aber the Chodesh. In other words, they made sure that the month of Tammuz would be a Chodesh Mole, would have 30 days. And in that way, they guaranteed that the night following the return of the Meraglim, when they gave their tale, would be the night of Tisha B'Av. The Chsiv, as it says at the beginning of Eicha, Karalai Moed Lishbar Bachurai. HaKadosh Baruch Hu designated a Moed at a certain time, so that when the Meraglim would come back on the 8th of Av, the following night, the people would cry, and that would be the night of Tisha B'Av. But Karalai Moed, HaKadosh Baruch Hu called it a Moed, and he's referring to Rosh Chodesh, and Rosh Chodesh is called a Moed. Okay, then. So this is where we're going to stop for today. On the top of Daf